Somewhere in America, in the fall of 1943, a mother sat down at her kitchen table and wrote a letter to an admiral in the Pacific. She addressed it to Chester Nimitz, Pearl Harbor, and in the letter she said one thing: "You killed my son." She was not the only mother who wrote that letter. There were hundreds of them. They came from Ohio, from Georgia, from small towns on the coast of Washington state. They arrived at Nimitz's desk every morning in stacks, and his aide tried to set them aside. Nimitz read as many as he could. He wrote back to as many as he could reach. And then, 3 weeks after a battle on an island most Americans could not find on a map, he sat down in a conference room at Pearl Harbor with 3 of the finest commanders in the United States military. And he told them what he was going to do next. All 3 of them told him he was wrong. This is the story of what happened after they walked out of that room. Pearl Harbor, December 14th, 1943. A conference room with the blinds half drawn against the afternoon sun. 4 men sit at a long table. At the head, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. R., a quiet man from Texas who had spent 30 years in the Navy, learning when to speak and when not to. To his right, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, 57, the strategist, the man who had won at Midway. Across from him, Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, 58, amphibious warfare, blunt, feared by his own staff, and beside Turner, Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith of the Marine Corps, 61 years old. Known throughout the Pacific as Howlin' Mad, 3 of the finest military minds the United States had produced. Nimitz looks at each of them in turn. Then he asks the question, "Gentlemen, what do you think?" Spruance answers first. His voice is even almost apologetic. "Too dangerous, sir. Turner is next." Turner does not do apologetic. Reckless. Outright reckless. Holland Smith folds his hands on the table. "Take the outer islands first, Admiral. Whatcha? Maloalap? Build your way in. Don't go straight at Kwajalein. Not yet. 3 men. 3 all the same." The room does not move. He does not raise his voice. He does not reach for the map. He just sits there. Because 3 weeks before this meeting, Chester Nimitz had stood on a beach called Betio, November 27th, 1943. The airstrip on Betio had taken fire throughout the battle. The engineers were still patching craters when Nimitz's plane came in. It landed anyway. He stepped out onto an island that was almost unrecognizable as land. Betio is a coral strip 2 miles long, not even a quarter-mile wide. Before the battle, it had been covered in coconut palms. Concrete bunkers, gun emplacements. Nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers dug in and waiting. After the battle, nothing stood above chest height. Every tree was gone, every structure collapsed or burned. The sand itself was black in places from the weight of the bombardment, and beneath all of it, the dead. Nimitz walked the length of the island. He did not speak. His aides did not speak. The Marines, still working with shovels in the heat, did not look up. He had been in the Navy for 30 years. He had seen the aftermath of battle before. Nothing had prepared him for this. The men tasked with burying the dead, had been working for 4 days. There were not enough of them. The island was only 2 miles long. There was nowhere to go that was far from the work they still had left to do. He did not write much about what he saw. Some things resist language. But here is what Chester Nimitz knew, standing on that beach, that no one sitting safely in Washington could fully understand. The men who died here did not die because they weren't brave enough. They died because the tide didn't come in. The assault plan on November 20th had called for 5 feet of water over the reef at each hour. That would have been enough for the Higgins boats, the flat-bottomed landing craft, to clear the coral and reach the beach. But November 20th, 1943 was one of the 2 days each year when a neap tide holds the water down. The reef sat 3 feet beneath the surface, maybe less. The boats scraped to a halt 800 yards from shore. 800 yards. The Marines climbed over the sides and waited. Chest-deep water, then waist-deep, then knee-deep, the entire way under fire. The landing craft that couldn't move sat there in the open water, taking Japanese machine gun fire until they sank or burned. By the end of the first day, more than 1,000 young Americans were dead, or would be by the time the guns went quiet 3 days later. Tarawa was not a failure of planning, and every man who died in that surf knew the difference, even if he couldn't say so. Nimitz walked back to his plane. He flew home to Pearl Harbor. The letters were already waiting on his desk. Lieutenant Hal Lamar was Nimitz's aide. 30 years old, the gatekeeper, the man who managed everything that came in and out of the Admiral's office. Lamar had tried to set the letters aside. He understood that Nimitz was carrying the entire Pacific War on his shoulders. He understood that the Admiral did not need, on top of everything else, to read letters from grieving mothers. Nimitz disagreed. He read them, hundreds of them, arriving every day, from small towns in Ohio, from farms in Georgia, in San Diego, where young men had grown up playing baseball and then gone to the Pacific and not come back. The letters did not mince words. You killed my son. My boy is dead because of you. What was it for? Nimitz wrote back to as many as he could reach. No form letter, no template. He sat down at his desk in the evenings after everyone else had gone, and he wrote by hand. He told his wife, in a letter of his own, that he was as distressed as could be. He prayed for the war to end. He wrote the word prayed. He visited the Naval Hospital. He walked the wards. He sat beside the beds of men who had lost arms, lost legs, lost things that could not be named in a letter home. He stood beside the bed of a 19-year-old who was dying. He told the young man he was proud of him, told him his country was proud of him. Nimitz would later write to his wife that the soldier died with a smile on his face. Nimitz walked back out into the corridor, and the next morning he came back to his desk. Now, here's the thing that no history book quite captures about what Chester Nimitz was carrying in those weeks. He did not regret Tarawa. He regretted how it had been done. He regretted the tide he had not anticipated. He regretted the bombardment that had lasted 3 hours against concrete built to absorb 3 days. He regretted the boats that could not cross the reef. But the decision to take Tarawa, that, he believed, had been right. You needed the airfield on Betio to reach the Marshall Islands. You needed the Marshalls to reach the Marianas. You needed the Marianas to put B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. Every link in that chain was necessary. The only question was this: how do you keep fighting and lose fewer men doing it? How do you take the next island and bring more of them home? That was what Nimitz was working out, sitting at that, reading those letters, writing those answers back. Every decision he would make from that point forward, every choice about where to strike, when to strike, how to strike, was shaped by what he had seen on Betio. Not as a lesson learned in an after-action report, as something he had walked through, felt underfoot, carried home in his uniform. He was going to fix it. The photographs came back in late November. Reconnaissance planes had been running sorties over the Marshall Islands for weeks. High-altitude passes, low-altitude passes, every atoll in the chain photographed and rephotographed. When the analysts finished their work, maps went up on the wall at Pearl Harbor, and something unexpected stared back. The outer islands, Wacha, Malolap, Mili, Jaluit, fortified exactly as expected, airfields, coastal guns, reinforced defensive positions, thousands of Japanese troops dug in and waiting. Kwajalein, the central atoll, the Japanese administrative headquarters in the Marshalls, the place they had held since before the war, was lighter, not undefended, not easy, but significantly weaker than what surrounded it. Nimitz's senior planner, Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, looked at those photographs, 47 years old, careful, analytical. He said one word: feasible. The Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Charles McMorris, agreed: feasible. Not safe, not certain, not without risk. Feasible. That was enough. What no one in the room could know, what no one could possibly know, was that 4,000 miles away, on atoll in the middle of the Pacific, a Japanese naval officer had reached his own conclusions. Rear Admiral Masashi Kobayashi commanded the Marshalls. 52 years old. Careful. Analytical. In his own way. He had studied the American pattern. He had watched them at Guadalcanal. He had watched them at Tarawa. He had traced their advance across the Pacific with the same maps and the same intelligence any competent naval officer would use. And he had reached the sensible conclusion the Americans would work from the outside in. They would take the near islands first. They would build their air bases. They would reduce the risk. Then they would come for the center. So he had concentrated his best troops, his heaviest fortifications, his most experienced units on the outer ring, on Watja, on Malolap, on Mealy, on Jaluit. He was ready. He was waiting for an attack that was not coming. Nimitz called the meeting for December 14th. He gathered them in the conference room with the half-drawn blinds. Spruance, Turner, Holland Smith. He laid out the intelligence. He walked them through the photographs. Then he did something that, in its own way, was as revealing as anything he would say that day. He went around the room, not by rank, not by seniority, one at a time. Raymond, what do you think, Kelly General? He wanted to hear them out. Every objection, every concern, every reason it might go wrong, they gave it to him. Spruance laid out the strategic danger. Kwajalein sat deep inside Japanese-controlled waters. Enemy airfields on those outer islands would surround the fleet on every side. Supply lines exposed, no fallback position. Turner went further. The plan was dangerous, outright reckless. The outer islands had to be taken first. That was the proper military sequence. Holland Smith, who had argued before Tarawa that the whole Gilbert's campaign was misconceived, found himself on the same side as Turner. Take Watja and Malolap, first Admiral. Build your air cover, then move on Kwajalein. The three men finished. The room went quiet. No one had said anything Nimitz had not already considered. He had been sitting with those objections for 2 weeks, running them against the photographs, running them against the intelligence on Japanese dispositions, running them against every piece of information that had come across his desk since he had walked off that airstrip on Betio. He looked around the table. Then he said it quietly. Well, gentlemen, our next target will be Kwajalein. Most of the men in that room gathered their papers and left. Spruance and Turner stayed. Whatever decorum had governed the formal meeting, it was over now. The two admirals pressed their case directly. This plan was dangerous. It was reckless. They said those words to his face. The same words Turner had used at the table. Nimitz listened. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who ended arguments with rank. In 30 years of the Navy, the people who had worked closest to him had almost uniformly described him the same way. Calm, approachable, genuinely open to being wrong. But there is a difference between being open to being wrong and being willing to let someone else's fear make your decision. He let them finish. Then, according to Spruance's biographer Thomas Buell, Nimitz said the sentence that ended it. If you don't want to do it, I'll find someone who will. That was the end of it. Spruance and Turner walked out of the room. The decision had been made, and somewhere in a small town on the Olympic Peninsula in a state on the other side of the country, a 22-year-old Marine with a tattoo on his arm was packing his sea bag. He did not know Chester Nimitz. He did not know Kwajalein. He did not know that in 49 days he would be dead. On the voyage back from Tarawa, Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner sat down at a small table in his cabin. The ship rolled underneath him. The Pacific went on for 1,000 miles in every direction. He started writing. He called the document recommendations for changes and improvements in tactics, techniques, existing instructions, and material. It was not a short document. Turner had been the architect of the Tarawa plan. He had signed off on the bombardment timeline. He had approved the landing craft mix. He had put his name on the operation that had put Marines in chest-deep water 800 yards from shore. And now, 6 weeks later, he was writing the longest report anyone would write about everything that had gone wrong. He was not defending himself. He was not blaming subordinates. He was cataloging his own mistakes in dry technical language and proposing fixes for each of them. There is a word for what that takes. Some men in his position would have written a shorter report. Some would have written no report at all. Some would have waited for someone else to do the work. Turner did not wait. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's own planning officer, Captain James Steele, put together a companion piece. He called it something more direct, 100 Mistakes Made on Tarawa, 100. That document became the operating manual for everything that followed. Every man who had died on Battle had, in some sense, contributed a line to that list. The tide calculation. R, written down, the landing craft specifications, written down, the communication failures between ships and shore, written down the shortage of amphibious tractors, written down the failure to scout the reef conditions in the final hours, written down everything that had gone wrong on November 20th, everything that had put Marines in that surf under those guns was now on paper. R, with a proposed fix beside it, and Nimitz, reading the report, kept Turner in command. The man who had made the mistakes was the man who had cataloged them. That, in Nimitz's mind, was not weakness. That was the only kind of officer worth keeping. By the time the fleet assembled for Kwajalein, 5 specific changes had been made that had not existed at Tarawa. The first was the naval bombardment itself. R, at Battle, the ships had fired for 3 hours from a comfortable distance, high explosive rounds against concrete bunkers built to absorb exactly that kind of punishment. The shells had hit. The bunkers had not cared. For Kwajalein, the bombardment would run for 3 days, not 3 hours, and it would use armor-piercing rounds. Rounds designed not to explode on the surface, but to drive through it, to punch into reinforced concrete and detonate inside the structure that was supposed to protect the men who lived there. The second change was the direction of the landing. At Battle, the assault had come from the ocean side, the obvious side, the side the Japanese had spent 2 years fortifying. For Kwajalein, every landing would come from the lagoon side. R, the Japanese had not believed American amphibious vehicles could cross the outer reef and attack from inside. After Tarawa, they knew better, but by the time they knew, the fortifications were already built. You cannot move concrete gun emplacements in 6 weeks. The third change was the preliminary seizure of small islands. Before the main assault on Kwajalein Island in the south and Raoi and Namur in the north, American forces would land on the smaller islets around them. Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson, tiny pieces of coral, some of them barely wide enough for a man to stand on, but wide enough for artillery. By the night before the main assault, Army howitzers on Carlson would be zeroed in on Kwajalein Island. R, Marine artillery on the northern islets would be zeroed in on Roy and Namur. Every major target hit from land and sea at the same time. The fourth change was underwater. Turner had ordered the formation of the first underwater demolition teams, the first of what would become 9 by year's end. Swimmers, men who would go in ahead of the landing craft in daylight sometimes under fire sometimes. They would map the reef. They would mark the channels. They would identify and destroy obstacles. They would make sure the men coming in behind them would not find out about a problem by running into it in the dark. The Navy would eventually give them a different name, the UDTs, the frogmen, the men who would decades later become the SEALs. They were born in the shallows off Battle, in the bodies of Marines who had drowned learning something the fleet did not yet know. The fifth change was the landing craft themselves. More amphibious tractors, better armored, better armed. Enough of them to carry the first waves across the reef, regardless of what the tide was doing on any given morning. 5 changes, none of them genius, all of them obvious in hindsight, all of them bought with the lives of the men who had died at Tarawa. But there was one man at Kwajalein who took all 5 of those lessons, and added something of his own. Rear Admiral Richard Connelly, 51 years old, the ships and Marines tasked with taking Roy and Namur. Connelly was not flashy. He was not famous. He was not the kind of admiral whose name ended up in newspaper headlines. He was an engineer's mind in an admiral's uniform, and he had a belief, if simple, almost blunt, that he had been working toward for most of his career. You cannot destroy a fortified position by lobbing shells at it from a comfortable distance. A shell fired from 2 miles away arrives at an angle. It hits the roof of a bunker, or the side, or the ground in front of it. Some percentage of the time, it does real damage. The rest of the time, it does nothing the defenders cannot walk away from. A shell fired from close range arrives nearly flat. It hits the face of the bunker directly. It has enough velocity to drive through the wall, not just rattle it. If you want to destroy a hardened position, really destroy it. Not just inconvenience it, you have to get close. This is what Connelly believed, and on the afternoon of February 1st, 1944, he decided to prove it. The battle had already begun. Before dawn on January 31st, rubber boats had slid out into the darkness. 7th Infantry Division paddled quietly toward four small islands at the southern end of the atoll. Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson, lightly defended. Most of the Japanese on them were support personnel, communications men, aviation to be in a ground battle. By nightfall, never expected to be in a ground battle. By nightfall, the islands were. By midnight, the 145th Field Artillery Battalion had its howitzers on Carlson, working by flashlight, registering their weapons on targets across the water. Kwajalein Island in the south was within range. 45 miles to the north, Marines from the 25th Regiment had done the same thing. 5 more small islands. 5 more artillery platforms, Roy and Namur, were zeroed in. On the morning of February 1st, the bombardment that had been running for 3 days was joined by everything that had been waiting in reserve: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, land-based artillery from the captured islets, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58. On Kwajalein Island in the south, 7,000 naval rounds fell on the Japanese garrison in the opening bombardment. The artillery on Carlson added 29,000 more before the Marines went ashore. 36,000 shells on an island 2.5 miles long and less than half a mile wide. The Japanese had built their defenses expecting to hold the beaches. They had built their strongest positions facing the ocean. They had not built for this. And then at 12 minutes past noon on that same February 1st, Rear Admiral Connelly sent a signal to the battleship USS Maryland. The signal read, "Desire Maryland, move in really close this afternoon for counter battery and counter blockhouse fire, using pointer fire for both main and secondary batteries. Move in really close." That phrase, in a Navy that ran on precise technical language. Operational codes, standardized communications. Stood out like a man speaking plainly in a room full of formal speeches. Move in really close, not advance to coordinates, not reduce range to optimum firing distance. Close. Maryland moved. So did USS Mississippi. She pulled to within 1,500 yards of the Japanese shore, 1,500 yards, a little under a mile, within easy range of the Japanese coastal defense guns. Within the effective range of anti-aircraft artillery repurposed for shore defense. The Japanese gunners could see the ship. The ship's crew could see the shore. They could watch, through their gun sights, individual coconut palms disintegrate as Mississippi's 14-inch shells hit them at nearly point-blank range. The bunkers that had survived 2 days of conventional naval bombardment began to come apart. The Japanese defenders sheltering inside them were no longer being rattled by near misses. They were being hit. From that afternoon forward, Richard Connelly had a nickname that would follow him for the rest of the war and the rest of his life. Close in Connelly. He had put his ships in danger to save his Marines. That is not a complicated calculation in principle. Every commander understands the trade-off in the abstract. What takes something more than understanding is the willingness to actually do it, to order your own ships into the range of enemy guns because you believe, down to your bones, that the men on the beach are worth more than the risk to your hull. Connelly believed it, and he proved it. At 11:45 that morning, on the northern end of the atoll, the Marines went ashore on Roy Island from the lagoon side. The first wave crossed the reef in their amphibious tractors. Then the second wave, then the third. The defenders who came out of the bunkers were not the men who had gone in. 3 days of bombardment, 3 days of Connelly's ships firing from 1,500 yards, had done something to the Japanese garrison on Roy that the planners had not quite dared to count on. It had broken them. Not their will. Exactly. The Japanese soldiers who emerged from the shattered concrete were still armed. Some of them still fought. But they came out dazed, disoriented, blinking into the smoke and the light. Like men who had been living underground for a week, the Marines moved across the airfield. At 6 in the evening, 7 hours after the first wave hit the beach, the 23rd Marines declared Roy secure. 3,500 Japanese defenders, 1 island, 7 hours. At Tarawa, Bedio had taken 76. But the story of February 1st on Roy is not just about what the bombardment did. It is about one man who was not supposed to be there at all. Private First Class Richard B. Anderson, born June 26, 1921, Tacoma, Washington. He grew up in Agnew, a small community on the Olympic Peninsula, the kind of place where everybody knew your name, and the nearest city was an hour away. Salt in the air. Douglas fir on the ridges, a grocery store, a schoolhouse, a mail route that ran twice a week. He graduated from Sequim High School on July 6, 1942. 7 months after Pearl Harbor, he walked into a recruiting office in Oakland, California. He enlisted in the Marine Corps. He was 21 years old. He joined Company E, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division. On his arm, he had a tattoo, 4 words: death before dishonor. He shipped out for the Central Pacific in January 1944. On the morning of February 1st, Richard Anderson was a mortar man. His job was in the rear, with his weapon, with his crew providing indirect fire support for the infantry moving ahead of him. On that afternoon, Anderson was not with his mortar crew. He was moving with the rifle companies at the front, carrying a box of grenades. The airfield on Roy had been cratered by 3 days of naval gunfire, large craters, deep enough that a man could drop into one and disappear from sight. They offered cover. In the middle of the afternoon, Anderson spotted one of those craters ahead of him. He dropped into it. 3 other Marines were already inside. Anderson reached into his box, pulled out a grenade, pulled the pin, stepped up to throw. The grenade slipped. It happened in a fraction of a second. The kind of thing that happens to hands that are tired or sweating or shaking, or all 3 in the middle of a battle in the heat of a Pacific Island afternoon. The grenade fell down into the bottom of the crater. 4 men inside. No time to pick it up and throw it clear, no time to climb out, no time for anything. Except the one thing Richard Anderson did. He threw himself on it. He took the full force of the explosion. The 3 other Marines lived. The crater carried back through the wreckage of the airfield. Evacuated to the USS Callaway, a transport ship anchored in the lagoon. He died that day. February 1st, 1944. He was 22 years old. He was buried at sea with full military honors somewhere in the waters off Rhinamore. Now here is what you have to hold in your mind at this moment. Chester Nimitz did not know Richard Anderson existed. Nimitz was 4,000 miles away in the map room at Pearl Harbor, watching flags move on a wall. He had made his decision 7 weeks earlier in a conference room with the blinds half drawn, against the advice of 3 of the finest commanders in the United States military. He had made it because he had read the letters, because he had walked Bedio, because he could not accept a version of the war in which more young men died than had to. Richard Connelly did not know Richard Anderson existed either. Connelly was on the bridge of a battleship 1,500 yards off the Japanese shore. He had ordered his ships into the range of enemy guns because he could not accept a version of success that wasted lives he could have saved. And Richard Anderson did not know any of it. He did not know that 7 weeks earlier, an admiral had overruled 3 commanders on his behalf. He did not know that 4 hours earlier, a battleship had moved to point-blank range on his behalf. He did not know that the bunkers on the far side of the airfield had been broken before he set foot on it, so that the men beside him would have a chance to walk off Roy alive. He was a kid from a small town on the Olympic Peninsula. R, who had walked into a recruiting office 7 months after his country was attacked, who had put 4 words on his arm and shipped out, and when a grenade fell in a crater on an island most Americans could not find on a map. He did the one thing that connected him, without either of them knowing it, to the admiral at Pearl Harbor and the admiral on the battleship. He refused to let someone else pay a price he could absorb instead. The battle for Kwajalein Island itself was harder than Roy. Down at the southern end of the atoll, the 7th Infantry Division of the United States Army went ashore on the morning of February 1st. The same day the Marines went in at Roy, the same tide, the same sun. But Kwajalein Island was bigger, and the Japanese garrison there did not break the way the one at Roy had broken. They fought building by building, bunker by bunker, trench by trench. The soldiers of the 7th Division had been trained for cold weather. They had been slated for the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Some of them still had their winter gear packed in their sea bags. Now they were in the tropics in wool undershirts soaked through with sweat, clearing pillboxes with satchel charges and flamethrowers in 90-degree heat. They fought for 4 days. The Japanese did not surrender. They rarely did. The men in the bunkers stayed in the bunkers until the bunkers were destroyed on top of them. On February 4th, Kwajalein Island was declared secure. Then somebody added up the numbers. Across the entire atoll, the main island in the south, Roy and Namur in the north, the 30 smaller islets taken in between, Japanese dead, more than 8,000, Japanese captured, a few hundred, most of them Korean laborers who had been brought to the islands by force and had no particular interest in dying for the emperor. Americans killed, approximately 372 across an operation involving 85,000 troops, more than 300 warships on a target defended by 8,000 Japanese soldiers. Now hold those numbers next to Tarawa. BDO Island, 2 miles long, 4,500 Japanese defenders, more than 1,000 Americans killed. Kwajalein, twice the size, 8,000 defenders, 372 Americans killed. The enemy garrison was almost twice as large. The American dead were less than a third. The military planners had estimated, based on everything they knew, based on the precedent's fortifications, that Kwajalein would take longer, and cost more. In the best possible way, Nimitz had expected the operation to run until mid-February. Kwajalein Island fell on February 4th. Roy and Namur had fallen on February 2nd. He was weeks ahead of schedule. On February 5th, Nimitz flew in. He had done this before, landed on a newly taken island before the engineers had finished clearing it, walked the ground while the smoke was still coming off the wreckage. He walked the ground. In the days that followed, as prisoner interrogations came back to Pearl Harbor, a picture emerged of what was waiting at Eniwetok, the next major atoll in the chain, 400 miles to the northwest. The Japanese garrison there was smaller than expected, the fortifications less developed. The window to hit it before the Japanese could reinforce was open right now. Nimitz did not call another meeting. He did not gather Spruance and Turner and Holland Smith in a conference room with the blinds half drawn. He did not go around the table asking each man for his objections. He did not sit with the intelligence for 2 weeks. He picked up the phone. He called Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, the same man who had told him 7 weeks earlier that going straight to Kwajalein was too dangerous, that it was outright reckless, that it should not be done. He told Spruance to take Eniwetok immediately. With the reserves that had not been used at Kwajalein, the operation that had been scheduled for May would happen in February instead, 3 months ahead of schedule. Spruance said one word, yes. He did not argue. He did not say, you were right and I was wrong. He did not say, sir, I owe you an apology. He did not remind Nimitz of the words he had used in December, dangerous, reckless. He just said yes. And that was the entire conversation between two men who had been in the Navy for 35 years apiece, who had come up through the same academy, who had watched the same wars. Who understood without saying it out loud what the other one meant. Spruance executed the order. Eniwetok Atoll fell by February 23rd, 3 months ahead of the original schedule, 2 weeks after Kwajalein had ended, in a single operation that used the same doctrine, the same landing craft, the same bombardment plan, the same underwater demolition teams that had been born in the blood of Tarawa. The doctrine worked. The men came home, most of them, when the war ended, when the last signatures went onto the documents on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. The name Kwajalein did not appear prominently in the American headlines. It did not appear in most of the headlines at all. Tarawa was famous, Iwo Jima was famous, Peleliu, Guadalcanal, Okinawa. Battles that had cost thousands of American lives were part of the national memory. Kwajalein was not. In a strange way, that absence tells you everything. History is drawn to the places where the most was lost, where the price was highest, where the photographs were most devastating, where the casualty lists ran longest, where the families back home had the most grief to hold. Kwajalein was won too cleanly to make that kind of history. Kwajalein is the battle that history forgot because it went right. But the men who did not come home from it were not an abstraction. They were somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father. They were boys from Tacoma and Georgia and Ohio who had grown up in the years between the wars. During the Depression, in a country that was still figuring out what it was and what it owed the world, they had answered a question that none of them had wanted to be asked. And on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that most Americans cannot place on a map, they had done what was asked of them. On August 17th, 1944, 6 months and 16 days after Richard Anderson died in a crater on Roy Island, there was a ceremony at the naval station at Pier 91 in Seattle. The wind coming off Puget Sound was cold. It usually was, that late in the summer, that far north. Mrs. Oscar Anderson stood at the front. Her son had grown up an hour east of that pier, on the Olympic Peninsula, in a small community where the schoolhouse and the grocery store and the mail route made up most of the map. She accepted the Medal of Honor on his behalf. The citation was read out loud. The formal language the military uses when it does not have any other language, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Private First Class Anderson fearlessly chose to sacrifice himself and save his companions by hurling his body upon the grenade and taking the full impact of the explosion. He gallantly gave his life for his country. She held the medal. She had raised a boy who had gone to a recruiting office 7 months after his country was attacked, who had put 4 words on his arm before he shipped out, who had ended up, for reasons no one could explain, at the front of a battle on an island most Americans would never hear of, and who, when the moment came, the moment nobody plans for, nobody trains for, the moment that simply arrives, almost a year later. On July 7th, 1945, Mrs. Anderson was back at that same waterfront, this time to christen a ship. A destroyer had been built at the Todd Pacific shipyards in Seattle. More than 300 men would sail her. She would carry her son's name into waters he had never gotten to see. USS Richard B. Anderson, DD 786. She would serve for 30 years. Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War. 3 decades of the United States Navy carrying the name of a 22-year-old mortar man from Agnew, Washington, across oceans he never crossed. His mother stood at the bow with a bottle of champagne. She swung it against the hull. The ship slid down the ways into Puget Sound. Now here is what connects them. Chester Nimitz did not know Richard Anderson. He did not know that in a small town on the Olympic Peninsula, a mother would raise a boy, and that boy would walk into a recruiting office, and that boy would end up in a crater on an island Nimitz had put on the map. Richard Connelly did not know Anderson either. He was on the bridge of a battleship 1,500 yards off a shore that Anderson was about to walk across. He was watching palm trees explode through his gun sights. He did not know that one of the Marines in one of the LVTs was a mortar man who was not supposed to be at the front, and Anderson did not know either of them. He was a kid from a small town who had ended up in the wrong place at the right moment. or maybe the right place. R, it depends on who you ask. It depends on whether you are the mother who buried him or the 3 Marines who walked off Roy alive because he was in that crater with them. But here is what connects them anyway. Nimitz read those letters because he could not look away from what his decisions cost other people. Connelly moved to ships closer because he could not accept a version of success that wasted lives he could have saved. R, Anderson threw himself on that grenade because he could not let 3 men die if there was anything left in him to stop it. 3 different men, 3 different ranks, 3 different versions of the same refusal. To let the people beside them pay a price they could absorb instead. None of them knew the others. All of them were there. On February 1st, 1944, there is one more thing worth saying. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, R, if your father was one of the young men who shipped out from San Diego or San Francisco in the first years after Pearl Harbor, if your uncle was on one of those transport ships standing off an atoll while the guns fired and the smoke rose, there is a chance he was at Kwajalein. He may never have told you about it. The men of that generation did not, as a rule, tell, not because there was nothing to say, because some things happened at a level below language, below the kind of words that work at a dinner table or in a living room on a Sunday afternoon with grandchildren in the room. Some things they carried quietly, not as a burden necessarily, just as weight, the ordinary weight of having been somewhere and seen something. That changed the way the world looked afterward. R, there are stories that exist only in the memories of the people who were there. Stories that were never written down, never recorded, never told to anyone except maybe a wife late at night, or a buddy from the same unit at a reunion years later, or nobody at all. Stories that will disappear when the last people who carry them are gone. If you have one of those stories, if you heard something at a dinner table, or in a car on a long drive, or in the last years of someone's life, when they finally started to talk, leave it in the comments, write down what you remember. Even if it is only a fragment, even if you do not know all the names or all the places, write it down, because those men deserve to be remembered by the full weight of what they did, not just by the battles that made the front pages, but by the ones that didn't, by Kwajalein, by the names no headline carried, but their families never lost.